The first time my brother called me greedy, our father's grave was still open behind him. That is the part people would probably think I'm exaggerating if they hadn't been there. They'd imagine some cleaner version of it. A family argument later, a tense phone call, maybe something ugly over casseroles and paperwork once the funeral was done. But no, Evan waited until the minister had stepped back, until the last prayer had already been said, until the damp March wind had gone crawling through the cemetery, and everybody was standing there in black shoes sinking a little into the wet ground. Then he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said loud enough for our aunt and half the people still nearby to hear, "You got what you wanted, Claire. Dad's barely in the ground and you're already acting like the house is yours." I can still hear the shovel leaning against the pile of dirt when he said it, a light metal shift in the wind. Such a small sound, but somehow it made everything feel worse. The morning had already felt wrong before that. I got to the church early because I was the one who knew where the extra memorial cards were, and because the funeral director had called me the night before to confirm the photo boards, and because for the last 11 months of Dad's life I had apparently become the person everyone called when something needed to be carried. Signed, chosen, explained, or quietly absorbed. I was 26, wearing a black dress I'd bought 3 years ago for somebody else's funeral, and hoping nobody would notice the hem had started to loosen. In my purse, tucked into the zippered pocket beneath a pack of tissues and a cracked tube of lipstick I never wore anymore, was Dad's spare house key and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in his uneven late-year handwriting. I had checked for both 3 times before leaving my duplex. At the church entrance, people touched my arm and gave me the kind of faces people make when they want credit for softness. "You holding up okay? Your father was such a good man. Let us know if you need anything." Most of them said those things to me while turning almost automatically to look for Evan. He arrived 8 minutes late in a charcoal suit that fit better than mine and hugged people like he was receiving condolences on stage. He had always known how to do grief in a way other people could immediately understand. Head bowed just enough, voice rough in the right places, hand at the middle of someone's back like he was comforting them when really he was positioning himself in the center of the moment. I used to think that made him stronger than me. Now I think it just made him easier to see. Aunt Ruth kissed my cheek and asked in the same breath whether the luncheon trays had been delivered and whether Evan had eaten anything. That was my family in one sentence. I nodded and said yes to the trays, no to Evan, though I didn't actually know. She squeezed my hand and hurried away before I could tell which answer mattered more to her. Pastor Mercer found me by the side hallway just before the service started. He had kind eyes and a voice that always sounded like he was trying not to interrupt something fragile. "How are you doing, Claire?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because people kept asking me questions that didn't have usable answers. "I'm here," I said. He studied my face for a second longer than most people did. Not in a nosy way, more like he was noticing how tightly I was holding myself together. Then he touched my shoulder once and said, "That counts for more than people realize." It was the closest anyone had come all day to seeing me clearly, and even then I could only nod. The service passed in a blur of hymn lyrics I didn't fully sing, and memories that landed wrong in my chest. Dad laughing with sawdust on his shirt. Dad standing behind the counter at Bennett Lock and Hardware, flipping a key blank between his fingers. Dad pretending not to wince getting into my car after chemo. Dad saying on one of the bad afternoons that he hated how illness turned people into projects. At the graveside, the wind picked up. Everyone gathered tighter around the green funeral tent, shoes darkening with wet grass. I stood with my hands wrapped around each other so hard my fingers felt numb. That was when I heard the Locks mentioned the first time. Not directly to me. Never directly to me. It was my cousin Denise whispering to her husband a little behind us, not quietly enough. I still don't understand why he changed all the locks like that. So strange right before the end. Her husband muttered something I couldn't catch. Then Evan, who could hear selective things from impossible distances, turned with a small tired smile that was meant to look generous. He was confused near the end. He said softly, "A lot of fear. A lot of influence. It is what it is." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was what made it land harder. Aunt Ruth frowned. "Your father was not confused." Evan gave a sad little shrug like he hated being the one forced to admit reality. "I'm just saying he wasn't himself. He would never have shut family out like that on his own." I felt the envelope in my purse as if it had suddenly gotten heavier. I could have said something then. Not everything, but something. I could have said Dad had his reasons. I could have said the new locks were his decision. I could have said more than my own silence. Instead, I stood there staring at the wet edge of the burial mat and said nothing. Some of that was loyalty. Some of it was shock. Some of it, if I'm being honest, was the old family habit of assuming that if I stayed calm long enough, ugliness might pass over me. It never really had. After the burial prayer, people started moving in that uncertain, slow way they do when a ceremony is technically over, but nobody knows how to leave a person in the ground and return to regular life. Coats buttoned, flowers adjusted, quiet voices rising half a notch. I had just turned to step back when Evan said my name. Not softly, not privately. Claire. I looked at him, and for one stupid second I thought maybe he was about to ask for the house key the way a brother would. Angry maybe, hurt definitely. But brother to sister, something ugly and human and still salvageable. Instead, he looked straight at me in front of our Aunt Jenna, 2 cousins, Pastor Mercer, and 3 people from Dad's shop and said, "You need to stop this." I blinked. Stop what? This whole thing with the house, the locks, the key. Dad didn't do that by himself, and you know it. The cold moved cleanly through me then. Not panic, recognition. He had planned this. Evan, Aunt Ruth said sharply, but not sharply enough. He ignored her. You were with him every day. You were handling his mail, his appointments, his bills. Don't stand there and act like you didn't get in his head. The worst part wasn't even the words at first. It was the sounds some people made when they heard them. That quiet inward breath. That little adjustment in the air when a room, or in this case a cemetery, begins reorganizing itself around a possible scandal. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. He stepped closer, grief and outrage mixed carefully across his face. He changed the locks on his own son Claire. Do you know how sick someone has to be before they start doing things like that? And now you won't let anybody in. What exactly are you protecting? I think if he had screamed, it would have been easier. Screaming is messy looks unstable. But Evan stayed wounded, controlled, reasonable enough to be dangerous. When I still didn't answer, he let the knife go in deeper. Or maybe I should ask what you're keeping. Jenna stood a few feet behind him with her arms folded, not speaking, which somehow said more than if she had. One of my cousins looked down. Another looked at me with that cautious, embarrassed curiosity people get when they think family pain might be turning into family truth. I heard my own voice finally, but it sounded far away. This is not the place. Evan laughed once under his breath. No, of course not, because the truth never is with you. That was when Aunt Ruth stepped in, but not the way I needed. She put a hand halfway up like she could press the whole moment back down into the ground with Dad. That is enough, she said. Your father was just buried. Not Claire didn't do that. Not stop lying. Just enough. Pastor Mercer's face changed in a way I couldn't read fully, but he stayed quiet too. Watchful, careful, maybe waiting. Maybe already understanding more than he could say in that moment. I looked at Evan, and something settled in me that had not been there before. Until then, some part of me had still believed he was a grieving son saying cruel things because grief makes people ugly sometimes. But this was not grief spilling over. This was construction. He was building something with my silence, brick by brick, right there beside our father's grave. I left before I cried. Not because I'm especially strong, just because humiliation has a way of making me move. By the time I got to my car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. I sat behind the wheel without turning the engine on. The cemetery blurred through the windshield, my black tights damp at the ankles from the grass. Then I opened my purse and took out the house key. It was warmer than it should have been from sitting against the envelope all morning. And just like that, I was back in Dad's kitchen 6 nights before he died. The overhead light had been too bright. He was wearing his old flannel robe over a t-shirt thinner than I wanted to admit, one hand braced against the counter while the kettle clicked softly behind him. He had slid the key across the table toward me, then placed the envelope beside it. Don't let anyone in until the right moment, he said. I remember staring at him. Dad, no. His voice was gentle, but it wasn't weak. Not yet. He looked at the back door, then at the new deadbolt he had installed himself, with hands that had started to tremble but still knew exactly what they were doing. Some doors, he said quietly, need to stay shut until the truth can enter with them. Back in the cemetery parking lot, I closed my fist around the key so hard the edge bit into my palm. Dad had known. Not just that there would be trouble, not just that Evan would be angry. He had known that keeping his trust would make me look guilty before it made me look right. And for the first time all day, grief was no longer the only thing sitting in my chest. Now there was fear too, because Evan had started the story at the grave. And I had no idea how much longer I could keep Dad's silence without letting my brother turn it into his truth. By the time I got home, I had 3 missed calls, 2 texts from numbers I knew and 1 from a cousin I only heard from at Christmas and funerals. The first text was from Denise. Hey, are you really not letting anyone into the house? Not what happened with Evan. Not are you okay, just that. The second was from Aunt Ruth, call me when you can. The third came 10 minutes later from my cousin Leah. People are saying things. You might want to clear this up before it gets worse. I sat on the edge of my bed in my black dress with my shoes still on and read that one 3 times. People are saying things. As if gossip had drifted in from bad weather instead of being placed carefully and on purpose into the middle of our father's burial. I set my phone face down and stared at the wall long enough for the room to lose its shape around me. Dad had been dead 4 days, and already I was becoming a version of myself I did not recognize in other people's mouths. I finally called Aunt Ruth because not calling felt childish and I was too tired to be childish properly. She answered on the second ring. Claire. Her voice held that older generation steadiness that usually comforted me. That night it mostly made me feel small. I'm fine, I said, which was not true enough to count as a lie or useful enough to count as an answer. There was a pause. Then, you and your brother should not have had that conversation out there. I closed my eyes. We didn't have a conversation, I said. He accused me of something at Dad's grave. I know what he did. But she still had not called it false. I waited. She sighed softly. People are upset. Emotions are high. The house is a sensitive subject right now. The house. Not Dad. Not the fact that my brother had stood in a cemetery and made me sound like a thief. I'm not keeping people out because of money, I said. Then tell them why. The question sat between us so cleanly it almost hurt. Because I couldn't. Because I promised. Because if I spoke too soon, I would be doing exactly what Dad had been trying to prevent, dragging the ugliest truth into the room before it could stand on its own legs. I can't yet, I said quietly. Aunt Ruth went silent long enough for me to hear the verdict in it. Oh, Claire. That was worse than anger, worse than accusation. It had disappointment in it, or maybe pity, and I'd never known which of those 2 things I hated more. After we hung up, I stood at my kitchen sink and watched the dark reflection of my own face in the window over the faucet. I looked older than I had that morning, or maybe just less hidden. The next day I went to Dad's house, not inside, just to the curb at first. It was a narrow brick ranch with brown shutters he had repainted himself every 6 or 7 years, whether they needed it or not. The March yard was still winter flat, and the porch rail he'd kept meaning to touch up had one long strip where the paint had peeled away. His truck was still in the driveway. His coffee mug was probably still in the sink unless I had washed it that last morning and forgotten. I sat in my car looking at the front door and remembered the first time I noticed he had started checking it twice. It was late November, cold enough that his breath showed when he stepped out onto the porch. I had driven him home from an oncology appointment and he moved slower than he used to, but his hands were still his hands. Capable. Exact. He unlocked the front door, went in, then turned back after setting down his keys and pulled it shut again just to test the deadbolt. You already locked it, I said. Did I? He smiled when he said it, but not like a man making a joke. More like a man seeing whether I would let him leave the sentence unfinished. A week after that, I had found him at the dining room table with papers spread out in uneven stacks. Insurance forms, utility bills, the property tax notice, and something else turned face down under his hand so fast, it caught my attention before I could stop it. What's that? I asked. Nothing worth your afternoon. He slid it into the drawer, then got up to put the whole stack away. Not in the desk where he'd always kept paperwork, in the hall closet behind the old board games and a toolbox that hadn't held tools in years. I remember laughing a little. That's a terrible filing system. Only if people know where you file things. At the time, I thought he was being wry, stubborn, maybe just embarrassed about needing help. Sitting in my car outside the house now, I understood that for what it was. Not eccentricity, not illness. Strategy. The feeling that had started at the cemetery sharpened into something narrower and colder. Dad had not simply changed the locks once late in some burst of paranoia. He had been tightening the edges of his life for months. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat and made me jump. Evan, I let it ring twice before answering. What? That's how you pick up the phone now? I'm not in the mood for theater. He laughed once, short and humorless. You should hear yourself. I looked at the front door while he talked, the new brass deadbolt catching a little weak afternoon light. I've had 2 people call me already, he said. Do you know how bad you're making this look? The nerve of that almost took my breath away. How I'm making it look. By dragging this out. By acting like you're the gatekeeper now. I'm doing what Dad asked me to do. The line went still for half a second. Then Evan's voice came back flatter. You really want to go with that? Something in me tightened. Go with what? This whole saintly little daughter routine. Claire, come on. You think people don't see what this is? I wanted to ask him what exactly people were supposed to be seeing. A woman who had driven our father to radiation treatments while working front desk shifts she could barely afford to miss, a daughter who bought incontinence pads and stool softeners and Gatorade without once telling anyone how humiliating it felt to watch the strongest man she knew apologize for his own body, a sister who had stayed quiet at a graveside while her brother called her greedy because she was still trying absurdly to keep the last of her father's dignity intact. Instead, I said, I'm not discussing this on the phone. You don't get to not discuss it. Jenna and I are coming by tomorrow. No. The word came out before I thought about it. You don't get to tell me no. Watch me. He exhaled hard. Dad was sick. You were around him constantly. You know exactly how that looks. There it was again. The same phrasing. The same architecture. Not confusion, not concern. A case being built. I hung up on him before he could say anything else. For a full minute after that, I sat with both hands wrapped around the steering wheel and felt 13 years old instead of 26. Then I drove to the shop. Bennett Lock and Hardware sat on a side street off Main with a faded sign and front windows. Dad cleaned himself every Thursday even after the business got too small to justify that kind of pride. The closed sign was still hanging. Marlene was inside anyway, standing on a stool with a ledger in one hand and reading glasses low on her nose. She looked up when I came in and didn't offer sympathy. God bless her for that. You look terrible, she said. I almost cried from gratitude. Thank you. She stepped down from the stool and set the ledger on the counter. Your brother was here last month asking where Frank kept deed records. I stared at her. Marlene did not dramatize. That was one of the things Dad liked about her. She believed facts were strong enough without decoration. He said he was helping your father get organized, she went on, asked whether the house had already been transferred, whether the business was staying in the family, whether Frank had made updates. I told him if he wanted to know his father's business, he could ask his father. My mouth had gone dry. What did Dad say? He changed the lock on the back filing cabinet the next morning. It felt like the floor shifted under me, not violently, just enough to remind me it had never been as steady as I thought. Marlene saw it happen on my face. Her expression softened by maybe half an inch. I'm sorry, she said. I figured you knew. No, I said. I knew some things, not all of them. She leaned against the counter and folded her arms. Your father was embarrassed. That was the worst part. Not angry. Embarrassed. Like if he named it out loud, it would become real. I looked past her toward Dad's workbench in the back where the pegboard still held key blanks in neat rows, and the small lamp over the vise was still angled exactly where he'd left it. He kept moving papers at the house too, I said. Checking locks, hiding things. Marlene nodded once. Then it wasn't just here. No, it wasn't. After I left the shop, I drove to the church because there was nowhere else my mind could go without circling back into itself. Pastor Mercer was in his office with his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled neatly to the forearm. He motioned me in like he had expected me eventually. I sat down and stared at the framed watercolor of the church steeple on the wall behind him. I need to ask you something, I said. Did Dad say anything to you about Evan? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his footing. Your father did not come to me to accuse anybody, he said carefully. He came because he was ashamed. I swallowed. He said he had reached an age where you think you know the difference between being needed and being used. And then one day you realized the line blurred before you noticed. That landed in me so deeply I had to look down at my hands. He loved your brother, Pastor Mercer said. That was part of the pain. Nothing clean fits around that. A child can still be your child after trust has broken. That was what he was trying to make peace with. I thought about Dad in his kitchen robe, about the way he had looked toward the back door before giving me the key. He knew this was coming, I said. Pastor Mercer did not deny it. He hoped you would act with care, not panic. I laughed then just once and it came out brittle. That's costing me. I know. No explanation after it. No easy comfort. Just, I know, spoken by someone who actually did. By the time I got back to my car, dusk had started settling into the parking lot. My phone was lighting up again. This time it wasn't Evan. It was Jenna. I almost didn't answer, but something in me had stopped wanting surprises. Her voice was cool and clipped, like she was calling about insurance forms. Evan says you're refusing to open the house. I'm not discussing this with you. You don't need to discuss it. You need to be reasonable. I shut my eyes. Your father is gone, Claire. Keeping the place locked like some private shrine is helping no one. The cruelty in that was almost elegant. Not loud, not vulgar, just precisely chosen. He told me not to let anyone in yet. Jenna gave a small exhale that might have been a laugh. And you think that means you get to control everything now? There it was, the same word underneath all the others. Control. They needed me to be the controlling one because otherwise they would have to ask what Dad had been controlling access away from. Tomorrow, she said, we're coming over. One way or another, this gets handled. When I didn't answer, she added, at this point your refusal says more than you realize. She hung up before I could. I sat in the darkening car with the phone still in my hand and finally understood what Dad had really left me. Not a house, not a role, a line. And lines only matter when somebody is determined to cross them. I reached into my purse and touched the sealed envelope through the fabric. Then I thought of Marlene, Pastor Mercer, Aunt Ruth, witnesses not spectators, people who could tell the difference between grief and performance if they were made to look directly at both. The right moment. Maybe that was all it meant in the end. Not a magical time when the truth would stop hurting, just the moment when silence would protect less than it concealed. I started the car, pulled out of the church lot and headed toward Dad's house. Not to open it, not yet, but to stand in front of it one more time and make myself say the next part clearly in my own head. I would open the door. But not for Evan alone. Not in a hallway. Not in anger, not on his terms. If the truth was going to enter that house, it was going to enter with witnesses. If I had waited for a moment that didn't hurt, I would have waited forever. The next afternoon, the sky hung low and gray over Dad's street, the kind of Ohio light that made every house look flatter than it was. I parked at the curb and sat with the engine off for a few seconds, both hands around the spare key in my lap. The brass had warmed against my skin on the drive over. It felt less like an object now than a decision. Aunt Ruth pulled up behind me first. Then Pastor Mercer. Then Marlene in her old blue Corolla, with one headlight clouded over. Evan and Jenna arrived last, of course, in Jenna's SUV, clean and polished, and completely wrong for the mood of the day. Evan got out already wearing indignation on his face as if he'd been forced into some humiliating little performance by my unreasonable behavior. What is this? He asked, looking from me to the others. You needed an audience. No, I said. I needed witnesses. That landed, not loudly, just enough. He looked at Pastor Mercer like he expected him to object. The pastor only folded his hands in front of himself and said nothing. Marlene shut her car door hard enough to make Jenna flinch. I walked up the front path before my nerve could start making suggestions. The porch boards gave the same small creak they always had near the left rail. Dad had meant to replace that board for 2 years and never got around to it. I stood in front of the new deadbolt, slid the key in, and felt every eye behind me as I turned it. The click was simple, final. A sound Dad had made a living understanding. When I opened the door, the house breathed out that closed-up smell of wood, old coffee dust, and his aftershave gone faint in the air. It hit me so hard I had to stand still for a second. Behind me, nobody spoke. I stepped inside first. Not as owner, not as winner, just as the person he had asked. The living room looked exactly wrong in the way houses do after a death. Nothing moved, which made every object feel louder. His recliner angled toward the television. The crocheted Afghan Aunt Ruth made him 2 Christmases ago, folded over one arm. His reading glasses on the side table beside the coaster he never used carefully enough. Jenna was the first to break the silence. Claire, this is unnecessary. No, I said, still looking at the room. It's late. I set my purse on the dining table and took out the envelope. My name crossed the front and Dad's hand made my throat tighten all over again. He'd written it slowly. The letters leaned unevenly as if his body had already started giving up on him before his mind had. Evan crossed his arms. You're really doing this? Yes. He gave one of those short, unbelieving laughs people use when they want everyone else to see how absurd you are. Dad was sick. If this is some dramatic note he wrote while he was scared, it isn't, Marlene said. Evan turned. Were you there? No, she said. But I was there for enough. He opened his mouth again, but I had already slid my finger under the flap. The paper inside was folded once. Just once. Dad had never been fancy with anything. My voice shook on the first line and steadied after that. If you're reading this, Claire, it means I didn't get the time to straighten this out myself. That is my fault, and I'm sorry for it. No one moved. I changed the locks on this house because I found Evan inside when I had not asked him to be here. He had gone through the desk in the den and had papers laid out concerning the house and my accounts. When I asked what he was doing, he told me he was trying to help me make smart decisions before it was too late. I heard Jenna inhale. Evan didn't. I told him help does not begin with a key you were never given and papers you were never invited to touch. He told me I was being difficult and emotional. That was the day I understood my son had started looking at my home like a problem to solve instead of a life I was still living. By then my hands were shaking again, but not enough to stop. Claire did not put these ideas in my head. She has done nothing but protect me, drive me where I needed to go, and spare me embarrassment when illness made ordinary things harder than they should have been. If anyone says otherwise after I'm gone, they are lying because the truth doesn't suit them. The room changed then, not dramatically. More like something invisible had been holding itself together by force and finally couldn't anymore. I kept reading. I am leaving the spare key with Claire because she knows the difference between care and control. I am asking her not to let anyone in until the right moment because I do not trust that my wishes will be respected while grief is still fresh and tempers are looking for somewhere to land. If Evan calls her greedy, controlling, or says she turned me against him, understand that I am writing this because I expect exactly that. That was the line that did it. Not because it was cruel, because it was precise. Evan's face changed first. The confidence didn't disappear all at once. It cracked around the eyes. "This is ridiculous," he said. He was upset. He was on medication half the time. "You can't take one letter, I said. And for the first time since the cemetery, my voice came out stronger than my fear. I reached into my purse again and pulled out the other papers I had brought. The refinance packet, the one I had found tucked in the back of the hall closet inside an old Monopoly box the morning after he died, when I was looking for a clean tie for the funeral home and accidentally found the thing he had hidden from where he used to hide everything else. I laid it on the dining table and opened it to the page Dad had marked. The note was in blue ink, written in the same strained hand as the envelope, but sharper. "Do not sign. Evan says this keeps the house safe, but it adds his access and removes mine in stages. Marlene to make copy. If anything happens to me, Claire needs to see this." I looked at Evan. He looked at the note and then away from it so fast it might as well have burned him. "You were refinancing his house," Aunt Ruth said, and there was no softness left in her voice now. "Behind his back." "It wasn't behind his back," Evan snapped. "I was trying to help him protect the asset. He didn't understand the paperwork. He understood enough to write that," I said. "He was scared." "Yes," I said. "Of you." The silence after that was so complete I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on in the kitchen. Pastor Mercer stepped forward, then not grandly, just enough to stand beside Truth instead of near it. "Your father spoke with me twice in the last month of his life. He was tired and he was ashamed, but he was not confused. He knew exactly what distressed him." Marlene nodded once, "And your brother was asking questions at the shop he had no business asking. Deed records, account access, whether Frank had changed anything. Frank changed the filing cabinet lock the next morning." Jenna finally spoke, but her voice had lost its neat chill. "Evan told me it was just paperwork. Just planning." Evan turned on her too fast. "Because that's what it was." "No," Aunt Ruth said. "Planning happens with dignity. Sneaking does not." He looked around the room then, and I could see it happening in real time, the center shifting away from him. At the cemetery he had spoken and people had leaned toward his pain. Here inside the house he had tried to turn into leverage. The same performance had nowhere to land. He looked at me last. "You really think this makes you right?" The question might have hurt once. In that moment it just made me tired. "No," I said. "Dad made me right. I was just the one willing to carry it." That was the end of it, even before anyone left. Not because there was some dramatic collapse, not because Evan confessed or apologized or fell apart in a satisfying way. Real life almost never gives you that much symmetry. He muttered something about all of us turning against him. Jenna stood frozen for another second and then walked out first, which somehow seemed to humiliate him more than if she'd defended him. Aunt Ruth did not follow him when he went. She stayed long enough to touch the back of one of Dad's dining chairs and say very quietly, "I should have stopped him at the cemetery." It was the closest thing to an apology she knew how to give. "I know," I said. Pastor Mercer left next with a hand on my shoulder and no sermon attached to it. Marlene paused at the door. "Your father knew who you were," she said. "Don't let being believed late make you forget that." Then she was gone too. After the last car pulled away, the house settled back into itself. I locked the front door out of habit more than fear and stood alone in the living room with the key still in my hand. The late light had gone gold at the edges, now thin and tired through the front window. It touched the arm of Dad's recliner, the stack of mail-order catalogs on the floor beside it, the little ceramic dish by the lamp where he always dropped his keys. I walked over and sat down in the chair across from his. On the side table was a faint brown ring from a coffee mug he must have set down one morning without thinking. I stared at it longer than made sense. That was grief, I think. Not always wanting the grand last thing, sometimes wanting the stupidest, smallest evidence that a person had been solid in the world. A coffee ring, a worn armrest, a deadbolt they installed themselves because they still wanted one thing in life to answer correctly when turned. I set the spare key in the ceramic dish. For a second my fingers stayed there beside it. Dad had not left me a prize. He had left me a burden measured exactly to my hands. The pain of being doubted, the loneliness of staying quiet at the wrong moments so the truth could survive to the right one, and underneath all that something steadier. He had seen me. Not as the daughter who would understand, not as the useful one who could absorb what everyone else spilled. He had seen me as someone he could trust when trust had become expensive. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. Inside, the house stayed still. I sat there until the room dimmed around me, my father's key resting where his own keys had always rested, and understood that sometimes the warmest thing a person leaves behind is not comfort. Sometimes it is recognition, and if it comes late, it still counts.